Picture this. It is the autumn of 1966. America is in the middle of one of the most turbulent decades in its history. The Vietnam War is escalating. The civil rights movement is shaking the country to its core. And on a Tuesday night, on a network that wasn't even sure it wanted the show, a small crew of actors stepped onto a low-budget spaceship set and quietly changed the world forever. Star Trek, the original series, premiered on September 8, 1966. It was not an instant sensation. The ratings were nothing special. The budget was so tight it would make most indie filmmakers wince. Critics were lukewarm at best. And yet, somehow, this scrappy little science fiction series went on to inspire generations of scientists, engineers, writers, and dreamers. It built one of the most devoted fan bases in the history of entertainment. And it launched a franchise that is still going strong nearly 60 years later. But the story behind the cameras? That's where things get genuinely fascinating. Because Star Trek didn't just happen. It was fought for, improvised, argued over, nearly cancelled multiple times, and built out of desperation as much as inspiration. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 20 strange, surprising, and sometimes downright bizarre facts about the show that started it all. Some of these will make you laugh. Some will genuinely move you. And at least a few will completely change how you see one of the most beloved shows ever made. Let's get into it. Let's begin with the man at the center of it all, or rather, the man who almost wasn't there at all. When Gene Roddenberry first developed Star Trek and pitched it to NBC, he wasn't thinking about William Shatner. The network had already responded enthusiastically to a different actor, Jeffrey Hunter, a legitimate Hollywood leading man who had played Jesus Christ in the 1961 biblical epic King of Kings. Hunter filmed the original Star Trek pilot, titled The Cage, playing Captain Christopher Pike, a quieter, more introspective commander than the one audiences would eventually come to love. Then something unexpected happened. Hunter walked away from the project. The exact reasons have always been a little murky. Some accounts suggest his wife at the time felt television work was beneath his stature as a film actor. Others hint at creative disagreements. Whatever the cause, he was gone, and the show suddenly needed a new leading man. William Shatner stepped in. And with him came something entirely different. Where Hunter's Pike was measured and philosophical, Shatner's Kirk was electric. Impulsive. Charismatic in a way that practically burst through the screen. The energy of the entire show shifted the moment he walked onto that bridge for the first time. Here's the tragic postscript to all of this. Jeffrey Hunter died in 1969, just 3 years after Star Trek premiered, from complications following a stroke. He was only 42 years old. He never got to see what the show became, never knew that the pilot he starred in would eventually be repurposed into one of the franchise's most celebrated episodes. He stepped away from Star Trek and stepped into history's shadow. William Shatner stepped in, and became one of the most recognized faces on the planet. Now let's talk about the character who, for many fans, defined Star Trek even more than Kirk himself. In Roddenberry's earliest concept notes and design discussions, Spock looked very different from the half-Vulcan science officer we know today. The original idea was for Spock to have reddish, deeply unusual skin, almost demonic in quality, deliberately designed to make him feel genuinely alien rather than simply human with pointed ears. Early sketches leaned into this unsettling visual. The goal was to create something that felt genuinely otherworldly. Then the production team ran into a wall that had nothing to do with creativity. Most American households in 1966 still owned black and white televisions. Color broadcasting was still making its way into living rooms across the country, and the network had to think about how the show would look to the majority of its audience. When they tested how red skin would appear on a black and white screen, the result was alarming. It read as very dark, almost black, in a way that sent completely unintended signals in the racially charged climate of 1960s America. The solution was to pivot to a greenish-yellow skin tone, subtle enough to suggest Spock's alien nature without causing problems on monochrome screens. The irony is beautifully absurd. When color television became standard and viewers could actually see the green tint properly, it was so understated that many people barely noticed it. The iconic pointy ears ended up carrying most of the visual work of making Spock feel like something not quite human. What started as a compromise born from the limitations of 1960s TV technology became one of the most iconic character designs in the history of science fiction. If you ask people to name the single most iconic piece of technology from Star Trek, a lot of them will say the transporter. The idea of being broken down at the molecular level and reassembled somewhere else entirely is one of the most audacious concepts science fiction has ever put on screen. It has inspired real physicists. It has generated decades of academic debate. It is woven into our cultural understanding of what the future might look like. It was also invented because the show couldn't afford anything better. The original plan for how the crew would travel from the Enterprise down to planet surfaces involved shuttlecraft, actual small ships descending through atmosphere, landing, approaching their targets. It would have looked impressive. It also would have cost a staggering amount of money that the production simply did not have available. The budget constraints were relentless, and showing a shuttle landing in every episode was financially impossible. So the creative team invented a workaround. The transporter effect was achieved by filming glittering particles, essentially sparkling dust, falling in front of a dark backdrop, then running the footage backwards. The result, combined with clever sound design, looked like matter being dematerialized and reconstructed. It cost almost nothing to produce. It required no elaborate physical sets or model work. What happened next is one of the great unintended consequences in entertainment history. The transporter didn't just solve a budget problem, it became the thing itself. Scientists have spent decades exploring the theoretical physics of teleportation. University research programs have run quantum teleportation experiments. When people imagine what a genuinely advanced human civilization might look like, transporters are part of that picture. A desperate cost-cutting measure became a cornerstone of humanity's technological imagination. You genuinely could not write a better story if you tried. Most television shows only get one shot at convincing a network to put them on the air. Star Trek got something almost unheard of in the history of the medium: 2 pilots. When Roddenberry submitted the original pilot, The Cage, to NBC in 1965, the network's response was not encouraging. Executives found it too slow, too intellectual, and not nearly action-packed enough for general audiences. They also had significant reservations about the inclusion of a female first officer, a character called Number One, played by Majel Barrett, which apparently felt too progressive for the network's comfort in that era. The entire thing was rejected. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. Rather than simply passing on the project, NBC did something highly unusual. They commissioned a second pilot. They told Roddenberry they liked the concept enough to give him another chance, but they wanted significant changes. More action. A different cast dynamic. A captain with more obvious charisma and drive. Roddenberry went back to work. He retooled the show, brought in William Shatner, developed the Kirk-Spock dynamic that would define the series, and delivered something with noticeably more energy and momentum. NBC accepted it and ordered the series. As for The Cage, Roddenberry filed it away rather than letting it disappear. Several years later, he cleverly repackaged the footage from that rejected pilot into a 2-part episode called The Menagerie. That repurposed episode went on to win a Hugo Award, making it the only Star Trek episode ever to receive that honor. The thing NBC said wasn't good enough became award-winning science fiction. Sometimes the rejection is just part of the story. Nichelle Nichols was doing something genuinely radical simply by going to work each day. As Lieutenant Uhura, she occupied a position on American primetime television that was almost unprecedented in 1966. She was a black woman in a position of real authority and competence, not a domestic worker, not a background figure, but a vital officer aboard a starship, treated with professional respect by her colleagues. For millions of viewers, especially young black Americans, that image meant something enormous. But after the first season wrapped, Nichols was ready to leave. Broadway was calling, and the opportunities there seemed more creatively fulfilling than continuing with a television show whose future felt uncertain. She submitted her resignation to Roddenberry and began making plans to move on. Then she attended an NAACP fundraising event. Someone told her that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a fan of the show and wanted to meet her. She assumed it would be a brief, polite exchange. It wasn't. King told her that Uhura wasn't just a character, she was proof. Proof that black women belonged in the future. Proof that representation in popular culture had real power to shape what children believed was possible for themselves. He told her she couldn't leave, that her presence on that show was too important to abandon for any reason. Nichols withdrew her resignation the following day. She later said that conversation was one of the most significant turning points of her entire life. And the children who grew up watching her, including, famously, a young Mae Jemison, who would go on to become the first black woman to travel to space and who cited Uhura as an inspiration, proved that King was absolutely right. It's almost impossible to think about Star Trek without immediately seeing Leonard Nimoy's face. The two are so completely intertwined in the cultural imagination that the idea of anyone else playing Spock feels almost absurd. But in the early days of production, Nimoy himself wasn't at all convinced the role was going to work, or that he even wanted it. His primary concern was how the character's physical appearance would be received. The prosthetic ears, the unusual skin tone, the severe haircut, Nimoy worried that audiences would see a monster rather than a character worth caring about. He feared being reduced to a novelty, typecast for the rest of his career as the guy in the rubber alien costume. These were not irrational concerns for a serious, classically trained actor. He also struggled deeply with the emotional requirements of the role. Nimoy was expressive by instinct and training. Playing a being who actively suppressed all emotional display required him to fight against everything his acting instincts told him to do. Every scene demanded that he find a way to convey depth and complexity while keeping his face almost entirely neutral. It was technically demanding in a way that few acting challenges are. What gradually changed his perspective was the audience's response. Viewers didn't see a monster. They saw something more interesting, a character whose emotional restraint hinted at hidden depths, whose logical exterior suggested a rich interior life. The stoicism became compelling rather than off-putting. Nimoy eventually wrote 2 autobiographies. The first, published in 1975, was titled I Am Not Spock, a deliberate attempt to separate his identity from the character that had consumed his public persona. 17 years later, he wrote a second one called I Am Spock. The distance between those 2 titles is itself a complete story about identity, acceptance, and what it means to be permanently associated with something larger than yourself. On November 22, 1968, Star Trek broadcast what is widely recognized as one of the first interracial kisses ever shown on American primetime television, a moment between Kirk and Uhura that felt, in the context of its time, genuinely startling. What most people don't know is how close that moment came to being erased entirely before it reached the screen. NBC's executives were deeply nervous. Concerned about potential backlash from Southern television affiliates and advertisers, the network pushed to have the scene rewritten so that the kiss was not a voluntary act. Their proposed solution was to make it the result of telekinetic compulsion, aliens forcing the characters' bodies together, removing any element of genuine connection or choice. The subtext was obvious: if the kiss wasn't real, if the characters didn't choose it, then it couldn't be interpreted as an endorsement of anything. William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols had other ideas. During filming, whenever the director called for a take where the characters kept their heads apart, the version the network preferred, both actors found subtle ways to make the take unusable. They missed their marks in ways that looked accidental but weren't. They found reasons for the scene not to work. Eventually the director had no option but to use the take in which they turned toward each other and the kiss actually happened. The network got its alien compulsion framing as a disclaimer. The actors got the moment they believed the story required. And the response was remarkable, including a letter Nichols later recalled receiving from a white man from the American South who wrote that the moment had genuinely forced him to examine his own beliefs. One unscripted act of creative defiance on a television set reached through the screen and changed a real person's thinking. That's a remarkable thing. Star Trek was never the ratings juggernaut that the network wanted. By the end of the first season, NBC was already making quiet noises about whether the show was worth keeping. After the second season, those noises got considerably louder. What happened next had genuinely no precedent in television history. The fan base, without the internet, without social media, without any of the digital organizing tools we take completely for granted today, mobilized with extraordinary determination. Estimates suggest that somewhere in the range of 1 million pieces of correspondence arrived at NBC's offices across the two major fan campaigns. Petitions were circulated on university campuses. Groups of fans literally gathered and marched outside NBC's New York headquarters. The volume and intensity of audience response was something the network had simply never encountered before. It worked. Twice. NBC renewed the show after both the second and third seasons, on the second occasion even making a public announcement at a fan convention, an acknowledgement that audience pressure had genuinely influenced a major network's programming decision. That was essentially unheard of in 1960s television. The third season, unfortunately, was a shadow of what the show could have been. The budget was slashed. The show was moved to a late Friday night time slot, basically the television equivalent of being put out to pasture. The quality of many episodes suffered noticeably. When it was finally cancelled in 1969, the ending felt almost inevitable. But here is the critical detail. That third season gave Star Trek the episode count it needed to be viable for syndication. And syndication was where everything changed. Without those fan campaigns, there is no third season. Without the third season, there is no franchise. The people who wrote those letters and signed those petitions didn't just save a TV show, they saved a cultural institution that hadn't even become one yet. The USS Enterprise, NCC 1701, is one of the most recognizable fictional vehicles in all of human storytelling. Ask almost anyone to sketch a spaceship, and there's a decent chance what comes out will look at least a little bit like the Enterprise. It is an icon on the level of the Millennium Falcon or the DeLorean from Back to the Future. The original filming model, which measured 11 feet in length, was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. The saucer section, the nacelles, the engineering hull, all of it meticulously detailed, carefully painted, and precisely constructed. On the sides and top that faced the camera. The underside of the model? Largely unfinished. Rough surfaces. Bare patches. Areas that had never been properly detailed because no one had any intention of ever filming from that angle. Every shot in the original series was composed from above or to the side, and the production team saw absolutely no reason to spend money finishing surfaces that would never appear on screen. That original model now sits on permanent display at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., one of the most visited museums in the world. It hangs there as a genuine cultural artifact, a piece of television history. And if you could somehow look directly underneath it, you would find the rough, unfinished underside of one of the most beloved objects in the history of popular culture. There's something almost poetic about that. This one is almost painful to accept, because it feels so fundamentally wrong. "Beam me up, Scotty" is one of the most quoted phrases in the history of popular culture. It has appeared on bumper stickers and coffee mugs and greeting cards and t-shirts for 5 solid decades. When James Doohan, the actor who played Chief Engineer Montgomery Scott, passed away in 2005. Considerable effort went into solving a problem that the script absolutely did not mention. The result was one of the most beloved episodes in Star Trek's history, achieved in part by preventing the cast and crew from being quietly electrocuted by adorable fuzzballs. If you spend any time in pop culture conversations, geek communities, or discussions about storytelling, you know what a red shirt is. It's the expendable character, the anonymous crew member who beams down to the dangerous planet with the main heroes and doesn't make it back. The character whose death establishes that the threat is real without requiring the show to actually harm anyone the audience is invested in. Star Trek didn't invent the idea of the expendable supporting character. That narrative device is as old as storytelling itself. But Star Trek gave it a name, a visual identity, and a cultural shorthand that has outlasted the show by half a century. In the original series' color-coded uniform system, red shirts were worn by crew members in the engineering and security departments, the people most likely to find themselves in dangerous situations during away missions. And those crew members, when they appeared as minor characters accompanying the main cast to hostile environments, had a statistically notable tendency to not survive the episode. The show never called attention to this pattern explicitly. No character ever looked at a red-shirted crew member and said something knowing. The visual grammar just accumulated episode by episode, until audiences had absorbed the code without being taught it. Red shirt equals danger. Red shirt equals expendable. The information was transmitted through repetition and visual association rather than through any direct statement. Today, the red shirt concept appears in film theory textbooks, in discussions of narrative structure, in corporate culture as a metaphor for organizational dynamics, and in academic papers examining how visual coding shapes audience expectations. Not bad for a costuming decision on a show that was perpetually short of money. Ask almost anyone who the classic enemies of Star Trek are and you will hear one word: Klingons. The warrior culture. The honor-obsessed fighters. The rivals who eventually evolved into allies across decades of franchise storytelling. The Klingons feel so central to what Star Trek is that imagining the franchise without them seems almost impossible. In the original series, they were actually secondary antagonists. The Romulans appeared first, in an episode called Balance of Terror, widely considered one of the finest hours the original series ever produced. The Romulans were positioned from the beginning as the primary strategic threat facing the Federation. Secretive, disciplined, guided by a rigid code of honor that made them simultaneously dangerous and comprehensible, they were clearly designed as an allegory for the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The episode in which they were introduced felt, and still feels, like genuine drama, tense, intelligent, and morally complex. The Klingons arrived later in the first season and continued through the series as a more direct, aggressive threat, warriors who valued combat more openly than the calculating Romulans. They were popular, memorable, and visually distinctive. But in terms of narrative weight and screen time in the original 69 episodes, the Romulans were arguably the more carefully developed adversaries. It was the feature films, particularly Star Trek III and the various television series that followed, especially The Next Generation, that elevated the Klingons to their current position of cultural dominance. The version of Star Trek that lives in most people's heads, with the Klingons as the definitive villains turned allies, is largely a construction of the franchise's later chapters. The original show was doing something more nuanced and more interesting. Captain Kirk's defining characteristic, as understood by popular culture, is that he trusts his instincts. He ignores the odds. He looks at a situation where every calculation says failure is inevitable and finds a way through anyway. It's the core of his heroism, the thing that makes him Kirk rather than simply a competent military commander. What's fascinating is that this wasn't accidental. It was an engineered narrative argument, built deliberately into the show's structure. The writers and producers made a documented, conscious decision to use the ship's computer as a specific foil for Kirk's decision-making. In episode after episode, the computer, speaking in precise probabilities and logical projections, would assess a situation and deliver a verdict. The odds of success are poor, the logical course of action would result in unacceptable casualties, historical precedent suggests failure. And then Kirk would look at that verdict, consider it, and choose differently. And he would be right. This was a very specific philosophical argument being made at a very specific historical moment. In 1966, computers were just beginning to enter public consciousness as tools that might eventually be used to make important decisions. The question of whether human judgment retained value in a world where machines could calculate outcomes was just starting to feel relevant to ordinary people. Star Trek positioned itself firmly on the side of human intuition, moral courage, and the kind of wisdom that can't be reduced to probability calculations. Kirk's victories over the computer weren't just action movie beats, They were weekly arguments for the irreducible importance of human judgment. The debate the show was staging in 1966 is, if anything, even more urgent today. Every conversation we have about artificial intelligence, about algorithmic decision-making, about what role human judgment should retain in a world of increasingly capable machines, it's the same conversation. Kirk always won. We're still working it out. Gene Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to be more than entertainment. He wanted it to be a mirror, a way of using the imagined future to reflect the troubled present back at audiences who might not engage with those same ideas if they were presented directly. In the America of the late 1960s, a country torn open by the civil rights movement, traumatized by political assassinations, deeply divided over Vietnam, that was a genuinely dangerous ambition for a television show. Network censors were vigilant about anything that seemed to take sides on social questions. Content that appeared to comment on race relations, on the war, on social inequality, could kill a show's relationship with advertisers and affiliates overnight. So Roddenberry and his writing team did something clever. They put their arguments in alien costumes. The episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, features a race of humanoid beings who have spent centuries in violent, genocidal conflict with each other. The extraordinary detail is that both sides of this conflict are composed of beings with faces that are half black and half white, the only difference being which side is which color. The allegory was about as subtle as a brick through a window, and it was brilliant. The censors found it much harder to object to metaphors about fictional alien prejudice than to direct statements about American racism. Other episodes addressed war profiteering through the lens of distant planets, explored political corruption through future governments, examined mob psychology through alien civilizations, and interrogated religious extremism through space-age priesthoods. All of it wrapped in science fiction packaging that gave the network plausible deniability and gave the audience enough distance to engage with ideas that might otherwise have felt threatening. It worked on both levels. The show got past the censors. And it reached audiences who absorbed its arguments precisely because those arguments arrived wearing spacesuits. The medium turned out to be perfect for exactly this kind of intellectual Trojan horse. Not everything in Star Trek's behind-the-scenes history is high drama and social significance. Some of it is simply, wonderfully strange. At some point during the show's production run, someone decided that what the world needed was a Star Trek cast Christmas album. This was not a cynical marketing exercise or a carefully calculated promotional campaign. It was exactly what it sounds like. The actors from a science fiction television show gathered in a recording studio and made holiday music. The results were exactly as delightfully odd as you'd expect. William Shatner, never a man to do anything at half volume, delivered a version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that managed to be simultaneously soothing and somehow slightly unnerving, a space lullaby performed with complete commitment by a man who understood that commitment was the entire point. Leonard Nimoy, staying true to the philosophical gravity he brought to everything, contributed a spoken-word piece called Once Upon a Star that landed somewhere between children's story narration and cosmic meditation. The rest of the cast, Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, and others, contributed with cheerful enthusiasm. The overall tone was simultaneously earnest and slightly surreal. A group of people who spent their working days pretending to explore the galaxy decided to spend some of their time off making Christmas music. The album didn't make any significant commercial impact when it was first released. It circulated for a while and then more or less disappeared. Then bootleg copies started appearing among collectors. Word spread among devoted fans. Eventually an official release followed, and what had been a forgotten oddity became a genuine cult item. Something passed between enthusiasts with the particular joy of discovering that the people behind something you love were also, occasionally, wonderfully ridiculous. Everything you have learned about in this video, the special effects, the alien makeup, the detailed model spacecraft, the elaborate sets representing distant worlds and advanced technology, was produced on a budget that makes the achievement almost incomprehensible. The show's per-episode costs were constrained to a degree that required constant creative problem-solving just to make the screen look like anything at all. Sets were recycled endlessly, The same generic corridor appeared as the interior of alien ships, space stations, underground bases, and Starfleet facilities, with minor modifications to the dressing convincing audiences they were seeing something new each time. Background actors were often crew members from other departments who had been persuaded into costume. When the director needed a crowd scene, he used whoever was available. Space battles, planet surfaces, alien environments, effects that today would cost millions of dollars for a few seconds of screen time, were achieved through hand-built scale models, painted backdrop matte paintings, and photographic overlay techniques that cost almost nothing to execute. The entire visual language of the show was constructed from creative workarounds, improvised solutions, and the kind of practical ingenuity that emerges when brilliant people are given impossible constraints. By the third season, the budget had been cut even further. Episodes that deserved to be visually spectacular were stripped down to conversations in rooms, because there was no money for anything more ambitious. The gap between what the writers imagined and what the production could afford became increasingly visible and increasingly painful. And yet it worked. Stripped of resources, forced back onto the pure strength of its ideas and the quality of its performances, Star Trek remained worth watching. Which tells you something essential about what actually made it great. The spaceships were nice. The ideas were what mattered. Here is the fact that makes all the others make sense. During its original 3-season run on NBC, Star Trek was not a popular success by any conventional measure. The ratings were mediocre throughout. The network was never fully convinced it was worth keeping. When it was cancelled in 1969, it left the air without fanfare, without a proper finale, without any acknowledgement of what it had been. By the standards of the television industry, it had failed. What happened next is one of the strangest and most beautiful stories in the history of entertainment. The show entered syndication. Local stations across America began airing reruns in afternoon and evening slots. And something unexpected started to happen. A new generation of viewers, people who had been too young to watch it during its original run, or who had simply missed it, found it in reruns and fell completely, utterly in love. College students discovered it. Teenagers discovered it. The ideas in the show, which had always been its greatest strength, turned out to age beautifully. If anything, they seemed more relevant in the early 1970s than they had been in 1966. Fan conventions began appearing, gatherings where people who loved the show could meet each other and celebrate something they had found in reruns rather than in original broadcast. The original cast began making appearances and discovering, to their genuine astonishment, the scale of what they had created. The merchandise appeared. The cultural weight accumulated slowly, steadily, and then all at once. The first feature film arrived in 1979, a full decade after cancellation. It performed well enough to generate a sequel, and then another, and then another. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, released in 1982, remains one of the most beloved science fiction films ever made. Star Trek, The Next Generation launched in 1987 and became a massive commercial and critical success in its own right. Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, the rebooted film series, Discovery, Strange New Worlds. A show that was cancelled as a ratings disappointment has now been running in some form for nearly 60 years. It has inspired scientists, engineers, and astronauts. It has shaped the imagination of multiple generations. It has influenced the design of real technology. The flip phone echoes the communicator, the tablet computer reflects the PADD, automatic sliding doors have become completely ordinary, in ways that its creators only half-jokingly predicted. Gene Roddenberry described his original concept as Wagon Train to the Stars, a frontier adventure set in space. What it became was something far larger and more lasting, a vision of what humanity could be, encoded in story form and transmitted across generations. The idea that diversity is strength rather than weakness. That curiosity is a form of courage. That the future is worth working and hoping and fighting for. The show that failed became the franchise that lasted forever. The cancelled series became the standard against which all science fiction television is measured. And the 20 strange facts behind its creation, the budget crises and network rejections and actor doubts and costume shortcuts and fan campaigns, are, in the end, all just different ways of saying the same thing. Sometimes the most important things in the world begin as accidents, held together by people who believed in them more than the evidence said they should. Live long and prosper.